Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank Professor Benjamin Dwyer for giving me the opportunity to open this conference with my research and my paper. I would like to talk about my research into the liminal spaces between notated and improvised music. I'm going to divide this presentation into 6 sections, where I'm going to outline the distinctions between composition and improvisation. I'm going to discuss improvisation and composition through the lenses of time, intertextuality, and the notion of authorship. And I'm also going to present a short analysis of a case study, The Blue Shroud by Barry Guy, which is an exemplary of a score that contains both notated and improvised music. Exploring the possibilities of composition and improvisation is currently a very exciting area of research developing all over the world. American jazz pianist Carla Bley harnessed this exciting approach in her compositions and comments. I write pieces that are like drawings in a crayon book, and the musicians color them themselves. So initially, let's try to understand what is improvisation. Improvisation is a process of music making. The creation of musical idea unfolds in the act of performance. Good improvisation requires musical training, skills in performance technique and practice, and the ability to perform on the spot, which are the tools an improviser can access during the spontaneous act of music making. Improvisation can be a solo act or one in which many improvisers perform, react, and engage with the musical material as well as with each other. Nevertheless, the creation of musical ideas also unfolds in the stationary process of notated composition. Therefore, it is important to discuss what is composition. Composing through notation is not strictly speaking a process of music making, in the sense that you hear the music as in a performance. Being a series of symbols and signs, it is a non-realized and a non-heard archival system through which a composer communicates with performers. The intention is to create a finished musical text that can be repeatedly performed accurately. Furthermore, the compositional act is always separated from the performative act. This separation allows the composer to rewrite, reshape, remodel, and edit musical ideas, which results in a kind of interrupted process, which I'm going to discuss in more detail later, and which becomes inscribed in notated form. My research focuses on the space in between notated composition and improvisation. In order to understand the area between the two, it is necessary to highlight that they both have similarities as well as differences. Composition and improvisation are two distinct processes of investigation in which composers and improvisers tap into their realms of embedded and applied knowledges with the intention to create a musical work. For example, both practices are a form of composition. In many cases, they both build their musical ideas on motifs, development of motifs, and both can be structured in time, although quite differently. As the difference is one of the process of composition, I will define the first as notated composition and the second as improvised composition. Detailed historical analysis is not suitable for this presentation. However, in order to understand the challenges that these processes entail, it will be useful to highlight some historical developments of the relationship between the improvised composition and notated composition. As I mentioned earlier, composition and improvisation are processes of investigation using different types of knowledge. Plato was among the first to recognize and articulate two modes of knowledge inquiry, techne and episteme. He refers to techne as embedded knowledge and episteme as objective knowledge. Greek philosophy formed the basis of much Enlightenment thinking. However, institutionalization and science-based verification reinforced a bias towards rational thinking in European society. The two compositional practices, the notated composition and improvised composition, are still signified as opposing modes of knowledge inquiry, rational knowledge versus embedded knowledge, and vice versa. The institutionalization of music set the composition into a foreground, and the position of improvisation gradually declined. Despite the dominance of the rational mode of knowledge inquiry, episteme, there have always been moves driven by more spontaneous and performative modes of musical practice. My aim is to break the boundaries and aesthetically merge these two musical processes. This, however, brings numerous challenges in terms of notation and navigating performers to improvise using their embedded knowledges within the realm of composition. As I mentioned earlier, both composition and improvisation can be structured in time. Professor of music in the Department in Jazz and Contemporary Improvisation at the University of Michigan, Michigan School of Music, Ed Sarat, made an interesting distinction between these two processes. In his essay, A New Look at Improvisation, he discusses the timeline within both musical processes and portrays notated composition as follows. By composition, I am referring to the discontinuous process of creation and interaction, usually through notation of musical ideas. Thus, notated composition is the act of composition which is by nature separated from the performative act. The notating composer has the option to step back, isolate, and reflect upon his or her ideas. This option provides the possibility of revision and amendment at any moment during the process of the notated composition. In contrast, the improvised composition can only occur in the moment of performance. Sarat describes improvised composition as follows. By improvisation, I mean the spontaneous creation and performance of musical material in a real-time format, where the reworking of the ideas is not possible. The improviser applies improvised composition, which is a continuous process of the act of composition and performance at the same time. They simply cannot be separated. In contrast to the notating composer, the improvising composer does not have the option to step back and reflect upon the compositional ideas as they flow out of the performance. They have to make all the compositional decisions in the moment of its creation, in real time. Whereas the notating process is always separated from the performative act. It is these distinctions that lie at the core of my research. My aim is to explore the interrelationships between the two, using transitional sections of a music as messengers, which carry as much musical DNA as possible between the two practices within a single musical work. For these purposes, I consider DNA to be information carried in structure, melody, harmony, rhythm, timbre, pitch, and other forms of musical realization. I believe that musical DNA can be transformed and transferred through the transition. In my research, the transitions are meant to function aesthetically. It is my job to navigate compositionally the performer from the notated material to the improvisation through the transitions in such a way that a consistent compositional language is present in both. To refine the complexities involved in this framing, I wish to introduce the role of the notating and improvising composer, as the improvising composer is both performer and composer. I will, to avoid confusion, refer to him or her as the player. It is the player who starts as an interpreter of notated composition and is led through the transition to be an improvising composer. This transitional space provides the possibility for the player to carry on with the musical DNA given in the notated section, but also to step into the role of improvising composer and take over the direction and shape of the musical material. Thus, transitions will be emerging from the notated composition proper to an improvised open format in a way that encourages the player to retain and improvise upon the musical DNA found in the notated score. In order to further clarify my position on this intersection between notated composition and improvised composition, I use the notion of intertextuality as framed by Julia Kristeva and authorship as framed by Roland Barthes. Kristeva discusses similar intersections and interrelationships between different texts. In the context of my research, it is useful to examine the relationship between the acts of reading and interpretation in a given text. Kristeva suggests that the reader engages in the discovery of a network of textual relations. It is the interconnection between works of literature, cultural background, prior experiences, and many other factors that influence readers' interpretation of the text. It is the different meanings and interpretations of a given text that mingle and form our understanding of the text. In her essay, Word, Dialogue, and Novel, Kristeva defines the concept of intertextuality as the transposition of one or more system of signs into another accompanied by a new articulation of the enunciative and denotative position. Kristeva's framing allows me to think about intertextuality not just as a way of articulating the relationship in written text, but also musical text. I have suggested that the notated score is not actually music, it is a musical text, being a series of signals and signs that has to be musically realized to be heard. Kristeva places the emphasis on the in-betweenness of text. Likewise, as I mentioned earlier, my aim is to compose transitions in such a way that they function as transformers, carrying what I call read text, which is the notated score, to heard text, which is the improvisation, using Kristeva's concept of intertextuality as a reference for my definition of in-betweenness. There is one further clarification that needs to be made here. As I've mentioned, the realization of the read text, that is the notated score, is not fulfilled until a performer interprets its musical signs. The read text is constituted as music, as heard music only in the moment of its interpretation. It is the interpretation that transforms the read text into a heard text. However, this interpretation is not an improvised composition. It is the transitions that are at the center of my research that carry the interpretation of the read text into a zone of improvised composition to the moment beyond the transition, where the heard text is both interpretation and composition. The word intertextuality is derived from the Latin word intertexto, meaning to intermingle while weaving. I want to harness this meaning as my transitions transform the read musical text to the heard musical text. Central to my research is the composition of the transitional sections between composed music and improvised music. It is these sections that I'm going to call interweaves. And it is this transformation that acts as an interweave of musical material. Because an interweave melts, blends, and merges, it breaks the boundaries between the notated composition and improvised composition. Interweaves therefore inhabit the space of Kristeva's in-betweenness. This is how I wish to use Kristeva's notion of intertextuality, which correlates with my formulation of interweaves. In her framing of language as a fluid entity, she has led me to formulate a distinct is a framework within which the relationship between the notated composition and improvised composition can be explored in new ways. In his essay, Death of the Author, Barthes discusses the relationship between the text and the author outlining readers' experiences and the historical and social elements that influenced literary practices. Barthes de-authorizes a given text and discusses authors' intentions, originality, and truth in their writing. Instead of focusing on author's intentions, he brings our attention to the text only. He claims that our ideas merge out of influences, experiences, and knowledge, and proposes a kind of shared notion of authorship. He says, "We know now that the text is not a line of words releasing a single theological meaning, the message of the author, God, but a multidimensional space, but a multidimensional space in which a variety of writings, none of them original, blend and clash. The text is a tissue of quotations drawn from the innumerable centers of culture." Barth's concept of authorship suggests that both notated composition and improvised composition could be understood through my framing of interweaves. Both musical activities carry on certain types of musical material that blend and clash in the space in between the two. Moreover, according to Barth, the reader's own previous readings, experiences, and position within a given cultural arena form crucial factors. These factors impact the picture the reader gains from the text. Instead of claiming the originality of the creation to a single author, Barth proposes that the writer can only imitate a gesture that is always anterior, never original. Similarly, all musicians are influenced from the very early stages of their development by various musical impulses, experiences, or teachers. A typical notating composer, for example, has spent their training a considerable amount of time studying other composers and processes as a means of developing the craft of composition. This period of study further informs composers of their unique position within their cultural arena. The composer then combines their influences and their own ideas in a new creative way and tries to recreate creatively their past influences. This is how musicians develop, learn, and reuse their craft through the mastery of an instrument or voice and compositional processes. My interweaves bring together both notating composer and improvising composer to share their compositional knowledges and abilities in order to create a single musical work. My intention in this project is to speak to the interdisciplinary nature of notated composition and improvised composition and the experiences of the player who needs to navigate between these two disciplines. To sum up my research, the player starts as an interpreter, but gradually, via the interweaves, becomes the composer. Kristeva's framing of intertextuality helped me to understand the change of the material. The composition starts with the read text, and we are led through the interweave to the heard text and vice versa. Similarly, Barth's concept of authorship helped me to understand the shift in the role the player has to undertake. The player starts as an interpreter who is led via interweave to become a composer-interpreter. Now I want to very briefly discuss test case The Blue Shroud by Barry Guy, which was very influential for my research. The Blue Shroud is a 70-minute long composition which mixes free improvisation, jazz, and Baroque styles, specifically pieces by Bieber and J.S. Bach. In The Blue Shroud, Guy masters transitional processes on numerous levels between various styles and genres. The transitions from one style to another are almost imperceptible and provide a constant, smooth flow of diverse material within the piece. I'm going to analyze a section called the sieve. The basis function of this section is to filter music from one small ensemble within a group to another. In an interview I conducted with Barry Guy for my research, he explained the sieve section from an architectural point of view, keeping in mind that he was an architect in an early period of his life. The sieve, as he says, is almost like floors in a building with little staircases, which are linked from one section to the other. You are coming from one musical entity and leaving behind the residue of ideas, which will be picked up by the next group, on the next floor, and so on. Therefore, the idea is always about exchanging and filtering material. Guy divides the group into 3 small formations, which overlap at various times. One formation is piano and trumpet, second one is brass section, and third one is strings and voice. The sieve section has 2 functions. It transitions material within the sieve section through the small formations stated, but this transition process is again further enacted on a larger scale as it acts itself as a transition between 2 larger sections in the score. In this sense, Guy creates a number of smaller transitions within a larger transition, somewhat like a series of Matryoshka dolls. The 2 most significant aspects of my work, the transition from red text to her text, are the shift in role of the player from interpreter to composer-interpreter, are also visible in the Guy's Blue Shroud. What this demonstrates for me is that these transitions processes can work in various different ways. I now want to present you to my own work based on this research around transitions, which I call interweaves. Here I use John Dowland's masterpiece, In Darkness Let Me Dwell, as a basis for exploring my own transition processes. I hope you enjoy it.